Our chart looks pretty bare. Let's add some axes to it so that we know what we're looking at in terms of data. We'll head to the code and let's scroll down to the creation of the X and Y scale. And just after the creation of the Y scale, we'll create the code that will then create the axes. So var x-axis equals d3.svg.axis. And we need to set the scale for this axis. We'll set it to the X scale and then the orientation, orient, and that'll be at the bottom of our chart. Now we'll do the same for the y-axis, var y-axis equals d3.svg.axis, and the scale to use is the y scale, and we'll orient that one at the left. Now we're not going to directly create the axes within the plot function. That is, we're not going to put x-axis here directly within this function. Instead, we're going to scroll down to the bottom where we call this function, and looking at the object that stands for params, right after data, type a comma, axis, colon, and open and close curly braces. Now we'll set the x property to x-axis and the y property to y-axis. What we're doing here is we're creating an entry called axis, and we're creating an object that has the two axes to use. With that, we can go inside of the plot function, and we're not going to create an initialize phase like we did with an earlier chart. Instead, we're going to create the axes at the top of this code, and we'll type the following: this.append g. So we're appending a group element to our chart. Remember that this represents chart because of the way that we have used the call function and passed the reference for this. Now, after appending the group, we're going to give it a class, so class of x and axis, and we'll set this to true for the second argument. Now let's set the transform attribute, .attr, transform, and for the value, we use translate, open and close our parentheses, 0, 0, except that this is the x-axis, so we're going to delete the second 0, which is the distance from the top, open and close quotes, and then we're going to interpolate the height of the chart. So from 0 to the height of the chart will be the translate value. This is the x-axis. Let's copy the information for the y-axis. We'll change the class to y-axis, and this will go back to 0, 0. Now we're not done because we actually haven't called the x-axis and y-axis that we created at lines 75 and 78. Let's go back to the x-axis over here, and just before the semicolon, type a new line, .call params.axis.x. Copy that. Just before the semicolon, new line, paste, get rid of the x. Now params.axis.y. Okay, let's head to the browser and refresh, and now we can see the y-axis at the left, which goes from smaller values to larger values, and the x-axis along the bottom. Now the x-axis does have dates in January, but it denotes the day, which I'm not really interested in. I'm really just interested in the numeric date, and it's also very crowded. So let's format this axis a little bit more. I'm going to head back to the code, and now I'll head to the lines that create the x and y axis here, 75 through 80. For the x-axis, I'm going to put my cursor just before the semicolon and create a new line, and we're going to use the ticks function of the SVG axis function, so .ticks. And here I'm going to set a special constant, d3.time.days, and for the second argument, 7. So the ticks function lets you format the ticks on an axis. So basically this constant is a special D3 constant, you can look it up in the documentation, that denotes the use of days within a timescale. And we want to stick to 7 as the distance between days. So basically we're going to be looking at starts of weeks. So save that, head to the web page and refresh. And now it looks a lot cleaner. We can see that every 7 days there's a tick. And that makes a lot of sense since we're dealing with months. I really would rather see the month and the days, such as 1/8, 1/15, 1/22, and 1/29, because that just looks a lot better. I don't really care that it's a Wednesday. So let's go back to the code. And after this function, but just before the semicolon, new line, .tick format, open and close parentheses. And here we want to use the function d3.time.format. And we've actually used this before in creating the date parser. except we're not going to create a parsing function. Instead, we're just going to use this part of the function to format a date. And so within the parentheses, we'll open and close a string, and we'll use the specifiers for month and date. So copy that from line 63 and paste at line 79. Save it, head to the web page and refresh, and now that looks a lot better. January 1st through 29th, and then the 31st is over here. And I don't like the crowding on the Y scale. It's too many values for me. Let's go back to the code, and just before the semicolon, create a new line, and let's set the number of ticks. So ticks, 5. So you can see that before we used ticks, and we were using this special constant time days, along with the distance interval. But if you just set a number, it just uses that number to distance the ticks that you already have. Save that, head back to the chart, and now that looks really nice. We have every 10 values, a number displayed at the left. So there are a lot of other ways that you can format your axes, and you're not just limited to dates. Instead, you'll want to take a look at the ticks function in the documentation for SVG axis and the tick format function to create really flexible and appealing axes for your charts.